Welcome to Weaving the Blanket, stories of faith, sacrifice, martyrdom, and emancipation of the Evangelical Methodist Church of Bolivia. This is Season 4, Episode 6, Part 1, the Hacienda Patron Peon System through the eyes of an 8-year-old boy. My name is David Stevenson. Many indigenous families have passed down the stories of life of the Hacienda Patron Peon form of indentured labor to their children and to their grandchildren. But fewer have been told of the abuses by Roman Catholic priests and by the patrons in those days. Unfortunately, some of the indigenous people today know extraordinarily little about what life was like for a peon on the hacienda. Today, some of the facts about hacienda life are taught in some of the schools. The facts are horrifying enough. But when you hear about those days from someone who lived it becomes much more real. With this podcast, I would like to share what the Hacienda Patron Peon form of slavery was like for an 8-year-old boy before the 1952 land reform. I met Eugenio Poma 34 years ago. He became my friend, then my mentor, and then my spiritual father. He and Dr. Herman Crespo, whose story I will also share, are the two greatest persons I've ever met in my life. Eugenio taught me about true spirituality, about following God even if you have no idea where God is leading you. He went from being a peon, living as an indentured servant on a hacienda, to becoming the Bolivian ambassador to Denmark and invited by the Queen of Denmark to sit in her presence, an extraordinary offer by the Queen because of what she had heard about him. His life is a microcosm of the experiences of the indigenous people of Bolivia over the last 100 years. Join me as we ride along the life of this amazing man. The early life of Eugenio is nothing remarkable. In fact, it's a story of millions of indigenous children in Bolivia who lived in the hacienda system. But its value is that it allows us to see what it was like to be a little boy, a little peon boy in the Altiplano, Bolivia before 1952. Eugenio Poma is an Aymaran, born in a little adobe village called Celcapampa, close to Ancarimas on the Altiplano near the shores of Lake Titicaca. There is a mountain nearby which has cliffs and caves, and a person could easily get lost or hide if they needed to. Thus the name in Aymara, Celca. Celca in Aymara means a tricky place. But in Aymara, Celca also means an individual. It means something similar to smart aleck, someone who's brash, self-assertive, and thumbs his nose at authority. Eugenio was born in a town whose name reflects who the man became. Eugenio was born in Celcapampa in 1944 to Pedro and Georgia Poma. He was the 7th of the living children. Actually, he was the 9th child in the family, but as is common in Bolivia, 2 other children had died at childbirth or at a very early age, probably from contaminated drinking water. In the United States, to get a passport or identification card like a driver's license, you show a birth certificate. But in 1944 in Bolivia, a minuscule number of persons were born in hospitals. Another system had to develop. When Bolivia, to this day, proof of birth and access to citizenship comes from your baptismal certificate. Up until 2008, all Bolivians were baptized Roman Catholic because that was the only baptismal certificate which was recognized by the government. Then when someone joined a Protestant church, they were baptized. But if you wanted a passport, if you wanted anything like that, you had to be baptized as a Roman Catholic. The children of Methodists, even the children of the missionaries that were born in Bolivia, all were baptized into the Catholic Church and then rebaptized into the Methodist Church. Now, the new Constitution of 2008 brought an end to Catholicism as being the only legal religion in the nation. Today, a baptismal certificate from any church will allow you to get your national identity card. The Catholic Church treated the indigenous with a great paternalistic disdain. The priests, mostly European, believed that the indigenous people were incapable of making even the simplest and most personal of decisions. For example, it was commonplace in the 1940s that the name of the children of the indigenous families were decided not by the family, but by the local priest. And he had a calendar which showed who the saint was for that day of that year, and usually named the child after that saint. After Eugenio's birth, his mother took the baby to the priest in Ancorimus to be named and baptized. The priest asked Georgia what was the date that the baby was born, and of course the peons on haciendas didn't have calendars or ever used them. So Georgia just said it had been approximately so many days earlier than when she came. Later, Eugenio, as an adult, decided he wanted to have an actual birth date. His mother told him he was born between January and February in the year of 1944. Georgia only knew that because the priest told her what year it was. So Eugenio chose February 23rd, 1944 as his birthday. How many people get to pick their own birthday? Well, after the priest decided when he was born, he looked on the calendar and declared his name will be Eugenio, which is a Spanish name. Now, Eugenio's mother only spoke Aymara, and as she walked back to Selkapampa, she forgot the exact pronunciation of the name of her son. And she began to call him not Eugenio, but Eugenio. And so for the first 8 years of his life, he grew up knowing that his name was Eugenio. The Pomas were peons in the Hacienda Patron peon indentured labor system. Their hacienda was owned by a patron whose family name was Bozo. Amusingly for a North American, Bozo means a clown or an idiot. I always smile when I say the Bozo family. What a great name for a patron. Life for the peons of the Altiplano was primitive. Matches to start fire didn't come to the Altiplano until 1952. Consequently, everyone was careful to keep the fire going throughout the year. If the fire went out, it was Eugenio's responsibility to go from the house to house looking for someone who had a fire so they could get some ashes, coals, and a spark to get their fire going again. Oftentimes, he had to walk a great distance to find them. The way he carried them home was to place the spark in some llama dung, cover it with ashes, and very, very carefully carry it home in his hand with his poncho draped over the whole thing. This was the only way to carry the spark home without the chill of the Altiplano blowing it out. It was a spark amidst the dung. In the 1980s and 1990s, Eugenio used this to describe the Methodist Church of Bolivia as that spark in the midst of the dung of Bolivian racism and oppression. The Poma's 2 parents, 7 children, and a variety of chickens, guinea pigs, lambs, and other small animals all lived in a small one-room dirt floor adobe wall hut. They would find wild herbs to deodorize the hut. Eugenio's 2 older brothers never learned Spanish. Education of the peons was strictly forbidden. The Bozos, the patrons of the Poma's hacienda, had 6 children. The mother and the youngest son lived in Selkapampa. The youngest son, named Nito, ran the hacienda since his mother was elderly and unable to do so. The rest of the family lived in Chicaga, which is Aymara for La Paz. Many of the elders of the community spoke of Mrs. Bozo as a kind woman. She was the official Catholic godmother of most of the children of the hacienda. This was good because it tended to lessen the oppression of those peons. Nito, however, was a strict ruler. The peons were not even allowed to look at the patron or look at his mother directly in the eye. That was a sign of disrespect. And if they did, they were beaten. One of the things that the patrons did require was that a few female peons were to be servants to work in the household. Of course, in the hacienda, when the patrons and their families had so much control over the peons that worked for them, many different abuses occurred. Among the worst was the sexual abuse of indigenous women by the patrons and their male children. The women couldn't protest because there was no legal recourse against such actions. Even resisting sexual advances could lead to the punishment not only of women, but of the entire family. So the woman had to submit. She just had to. Eugenio was the one who told me about this horrid practice and how it was prevalent up until 1952. He also added that he is quite certain that his mother had to go through such an evil experience from Nito. Eugenio told me, quote, "It's hard to forget. I don't have hatred for them anymore, but the Bible says forgive your enemy. The Bible preaches peace, but it is hard to forget," unquote. The peons at the Bozo Hacienda were required to farm the huge estate, and the Patron would receive all the income from the farming. Once they were through farming the Patron's land, they would then be allowed to farm the small plots of less productive land, which were set aside for the peons to grow their own food. There were 20 peon families on the Bozo Hacienda. The Patron divided the land that was to be farmed for him into 20 equal parts and assigned each family a plot. On the average, the families worked about 4 days on the Patron's land and, of course, received no pay, no benefit from that work. The other 3 days, the peons worked the small plots which were assigned to them to raise food and to feed their own families. In the Poma's case, as in most situations, the peons were given the hillsides to farm where it was difficult to farm and erosion had done so much damage. The fertile flatlands were for the Patrons. The peons had many duties. First, they had to cultivate and produce the potatoes, barley, beans, and other crops. Second, they had to take care of the dairy cows. And they were also responsible to care for the sheep, and they milked goats to make cheese. The Pomas were assigned to be shepherds. Raising sheep in the Altiplano is very dangerous. The lambs in particular were susceptible to many dangers. You could easily lose them in the rain, the frost, or to the fox. However, not all families had the same number of children. So those with fewer children could not possibly farm their assigned plot and still have enough time to farm their private plot to feed the family. The Patron did not agree to the idea of larger families could help out smaller families. Well, the 1st of November was the end of the year for the haciendas and the time of accounting. Each family was expected to produce a certain amount of potatoes or other crops. The sheep were expected to produce a certain number of lambs. If you had begun the year with 100 hacienda sheep, you were responsible to produce perhaps 80 lambs. If the sheep didn't produce that many lambs, or a lamb had died for any reason, your fault or not, you were still responsible and had to replace that lamb from your own personal flock. In this unbelievably unjust situation, the Aymara tradition of Ayni proved to be vital. Ayni, that's A-Y-N-I, Ayni basically means community, but has a much deeper, much richer meaning than the English word community. To live in Ayni with others means you live in reciprocity, interrelatedness, or interdependence with them. I help you now, you help me later. And you are a part of that Ayni, that community, for the rest of your life, even if you moved away from home. In the days before the conquistadors, when one person had a good crop, his family would share those with those whose crops had failed. And then perhaps in the future, they would need to share with you when your crop failed. Even to today, Ayni is practiced in the campo. When a family slaughters a lamb to eat, they share it with the whole community, even though they have no idea when they will be able to eat meat again. You share with your neighbors, they share with you. Ayni became critical during the time of the Patrons. On the last day of October, a few days before the day of accounting with the Patron, the community would secretly gather together and ask, okay, how many lambs are you short this year? And the relatives and friends would make up the difference, sometimes from the small excess of their portion of the Patron's flock, but usually from their own personal flocks. This was necessary as the Bozos were perhaps more authoritarian than some other Patrons, and if a peon didn't make his quota, he would be beaten or worse. Eugenio remembers with deep emotion when, at age 8, an older sister had been watching the flock during springtime, and they lost 6 lambs. He remembers how embarrassed and fearful he was to report that to the community. But more importantly, he remembers the incredible generosity, forgiveness, and sacrifice of the extended family and his Aini, his community. They came to his aid and found 6 lambs to replace the ones he had lost. And for those families who had few children and not enough workers to farm both the Patron's land and their own plots, once again, Aini came into play. The larger families would frequently and secretly send one of their family members to assist those families with fewer workers. The Patron never knew this was going on, but in times of hardship and oppression, Aini was highly practiced, and it kept many families from complete starvation. But the Bozos could also be generous at times. The Bozos would hold a great harvest fiesta and congratulate those who'd watched the herds because they had been so successful. And he never lost a lamb. And he would tell them, "You Aymars are good people, you're good farmers." The great Patron never knew about how the community had to help each other out, and they never understood why the Aymara so desperately wanted the land reform of 1952. To the Patrons, the Aymara seemed very happy with the way things were. After the harvest, the produce needed to be transported to La Paz, where the majority of the family lived. Once it was there, it could feed the Bozos living in La Paz, and the rest could be sold to pay for the luxurious lifestyle that they lived. Well, the produce had to be transported to La Paz in a great processional of peons led by the Patron. The Patron and his assistants would ride fine horses decked out in flowers and other decorations, and they wore their finest riding clothes. The peons, of course, walked along carrying heavy loads of meat, potatoes, wool, and other crops they had grown. This processional would take 8 hours or so to get from Celcapampa to Ancarimas, and another 3 days to La Paz. The processional was also a time for the Patron to show off, a time to display how successful the Bozo family was, how obedient were their peons, and how much food they had produced. It was especially important for the Bozos to make a big show for the Spanish elite in Achacachi, as that is where they socialized and where their friends lived. Eugenio told me a story as we were riding in a car in 1988 about his father and oldest brother remembering one of the trips to take the commodities to La Paz. I'm sorry for the background noise. Eugenio has talked to several former patrons about this practice and the practice of the Hacienda system since his rise to becoming a person of power and respect. One former patron said that it wasn't really their fault that the indigenous were so poorly treated. It was the law, and we were simply following the law. I find that completely morally bankrupt. An evil law created to give you, your race, your people, nearly absolute control over another people is wrong. And you should find ways to get around those laws to be more equitable, and you should fight to end those apartheid-type laws. However, apparently today's Criollo often hide behind the laws and say, look, it wasn't our fault. In spite of all this oppression and deprivation, Pedro and Georgia Poma provided a very loving, caring family atmosphere for Eugenio and his siblings. Georgia in particular was a great woman who taught Eugenio about the love of the land, and she was a leader and spokesperson for the village at times. Many came to her for advice, and late at night, with only the light of the fire in their tiny hut, Georgia would sit and tell stories about the ancient ways, the great heroes of the ancient Aymara people, and tales about life before the conquistadors. And she taught about the importance of respecting all of nature. Eugenio tells the story how one day he and his brother Enrique found 5 perdiz eggs, it's a type of partridge, which were particularly delicious. They proudly brought them home expecting compliments for bringing home such wonderful food. But when the family got home from working in the field, his parents immediately began to question the boys. Where did you find them? How did you find the nest? Was the mother perdiz there or not? And the boys answered the questions. Then the final question, how many eggs were in the nest? 5, the boys answered. And everybody in shock responded, 5? You brought them all? Another said, you must learn that you must leave at least half of the eggs because when you pick them all up, Mother Perdiz will be very unhappy. Besides, if you pick up all the eggs, there will not be many perdizes for the next season. We felt very badly. We had never thought about these things. Later, they boiled the eggs and we ate them with a constant warning that next time, never forget to leave some of the eggs. On holidays, the Pomas often would go to Anchoraimas to shop. Now, Anchoraimas was a colonial town where the vast majority of people were Hispanics who ran the haciendas in the area. It was a strong center for the colonial culture. That is until, as we heard, until the late 1950s, when Eugenio's future father-in-law was falsely arrested and created the siege of Anchoraimas. But before 1950, the kids would go, and they really looked forward to going to Anchoraimas. They would buy pasquanquala, which is a popcorn with a little sugar on it. Those trips were the only times that Eugenio ever had sugar as a child. But when the children from Selcapampa and the other surrounding villages would go to Anchoraimas, it wasn't unusual for the town children to make fun of them. At times they would take away their yuchas, the knitted hats, and make them into small balls or soccer balls and play with them until they tired of the game. And the Aymara children would look to their parents for support to get their hats back, but the parents couldn't say anything. And the children just had to learn their place in society, which was behind every Criollo child. Some years later, the indigenous kids from the Campo would get their revenge. Once there were some schools in the Campo, the schools would form football or what we would call soccer teams. And whenever one of the rural schools played the Hispanic kids from Anchoraimas, the rural schools played with vengeance. And they would clobber the team from Anchoraimas and run the score up to embarrassing numbers just to get their revenge. Not all of the Bozo children were as bad as their parents. The eldest daughter, Carmen, and her husband, Ernesto Aliaga, had no children. Ernesto was a lawyer in La Paz, and they lived there. And they would occasionally bring a peon child from the hacienda to live with them and serve as a houseboy or girl, and also be the child's guardian while they were in La Paz. Carmen made sure that the peons received some elementary education and learned Spanish in late-night education. Now, the discrimination against the indigenous was particularly strong in the cities. To have an urban family bring in indigenous children and educate them was quite unusual, even if they were using them as servants. In fact, Carmen was so kind to these children, she was called an Indian lover by her siblings. In 1951, when Eugenio was 7 or 8 years old, Eugenio was sent to live with the Aliagas. During this stay, Eugenio learned Spanish, which would become immensely helpful for him in the future. While in La Paz, Eugenio also learned his place in society. His time in the household, quote, helped me to understand that we Indians were less and seen as not fully human beings. At least that is what I came to feel. But I had to accept it as a given fact. What is important to me was to learn how to survive. It was clear that one had to be humble, obedient, and go with the rules of the house, unquote. He was to do these chores for the families and then sleep on a straw mattress in the corner of a room and clean up and pick up the area before the patrons woke up. He served the family at their table and then ate the leftovers in the kitchen. The food was great, but often there wasn't enough leftovers and they would be hungry. And above all, he knew he must not mix his cloths, his plates, his silverware with those of the patron. The patrons were sure that there were special germs that came from the Indians, healthy or not. During this time in the Aliaga home in La Paz, Eugenio was exposed to Catholic Christianity. It was a new way of thinking and believing. It wasn't the traditional beliefs of the Pachamama, Mother Earth, and Tatito, the Creator. Instead, prayers went to Virgin Mary and to Jesus, and it had an impact on him and started him on the spiritual journey to search for God in his life. While the young Eugenio was living in La Paz, the 1952 revolution broke out. As we have seen, the revolution was led by 2 Hispanic graduates of the American Institutes. But there was clearly an element of an indigenous uprising as a part of the revolution. The urban elite felt threatened by all indigenous people and even believed that indigenous children would turn against the whites and perhaps even harm them. So Eugenio was sent back to Celcapampa. With the Land Reform Act, the Hacienda Patron system was supposed to come to an end. As we heard in a previous episode, the patrons no longer legally owned the land. It was taken from them and given to the peasants who had farmed the land for generations. The former peons were now called campesinos, which simply means rural people. Up until 1952, peons were not even allowed in certain parts of the city of La Paz, such as Plaza de Murillo, where the main government buildings are, or parts of the city where the elite lived. But suddenly, indigenous could go anywhere they wanted in the city. The new freedom and quasi-equality of the peons was not only a shock to the elite, it was a shock to the indigenous. Many indigenous feared this newfound freedom. There was security in simply following the orders of the patron. In addition, many of the patrons hired thugs to come in and intimidate and beat those who tried to enforce the law of confiscating the land from the patrons and redistributing it to the people who had actually worked the land. When Eugenio returned to Celcapampa, the peons on the Bozo Hacienda were still following the old ways. They still served the patron. A great argument arose between the young and the elderly members of the indigenous. The elders feared the changes, feared what would happen if the patrons didn't make the big decisions about crops and planting. But the young people wanted the change. They wanted the freedom, the opportunity to be complete human beings, and demanded the new laws be followed. So for a couple of years, the Bozo's Hacienda was run as before, all for the good of the patron. But eventually pressure from the young members of the hacienda and the pressure from the indigenous people from neighboring haciendas who had become emancipated was too much to resist, and the 20 families took the land back and sent the Bozos packing back to La Paz. Eugenio, the Pomas, and all those on the Bozo Hacienda were now free from their indentured servanthood. They farmed only their own land in the fertile valley, and food became much more plentiful. It was now time for Eugenio and the rest of the indigenous to step forward into full citizenship, full equality. But how could they do this when the vast majority were illiterate and uneducated? So the communities began to look for where they could receive this education for themselves and for their children. And it was at this critical moment in Bolivian history that the Methodist Church declared Bolivia the land of decision, and missionaries poured into Bolivia and provided places for the indigenous to go to get that education. But next year, at the age of 9, Eugenio would make one of the most life-altering decisions made by any 9-year-old. He could leave his family, and it would possibly lead toward an almost unbelievable life for an Aymara. Eugenio could become a Patron himself. Or he could stay with his family and go into the unknown future, desperately seeking education in a place where, as far as he knew, there was none. And Eugenio, at age 9, had to make his own decision. But that story will have to wait until the next episode. This portion of the life story of Eugenio Poma comes from several sources. I'm especially indebted to the book Journey to Dignity, the autobiography of Eugenio Poma, with Dr. James B. Palmer, published by Timberwolf Press in Allen, Texas in 2006. I've also drawn on dozens of hours of audio and video interviews and discussions between myself and His Excellency Bishop Eugenio Poma over the last 33 years. Next week, we will continue Eugenio's story as he becomes a Methodist, becomes perhaps the second indigenous person in the history of Bolivia to get a high school education, gets to go to the United States to get a degree in education, and returns to Bolivia to run a school, and we will find out where he was on July 16, 1980, the day before the Garcia Mesa coup. See you next time.